Hey y'all, I'm Stewart from the Central Arkansas Library System. I'm joined by Catherine.
Hi, I'm Katherine O'Brien. I work at the main library with the Youth Services Department. I work on level 4.
And we are going to discuss the Twilight Zone. Not the cool new one by Jordan Peele, but the old school Rod Serling Twilight Zone. Because, I was thinking about the Twilight Zone and how Rod Serling approached all these subjects that were really relevant at the time, mostly driven by like fear about the atomic bomb and that sort of stuff. But those themes are relevant again because we're all alone and paranoid and feeling crazy things.
Yes.
We can re-examine those episodes in a more modern context, and we can discuss that. Cool. So here we are.
Awesome.
Be a name for this, but I don't have one.
That's okay.
A cool name later.
Yeah. Brainstorm.
We'll edit that in.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So I'll go ahead. I can introduce the episode that we're talking about today.
Right. Yeah, that was easy. Episode 1.
Yeah, it's episode 1. It's the first one. It's called Where Is Everybody? Mm-hmm. So this episode was really like the first episode that like put the show on the map. Like it was sort of, you could call it a pilot. There was a lot about this episode that was like really different actually than a lot of the other episodes. Like actually the really well known and like classic Twilight Zone, I guess theme song, like the song that plays in the very beginning, and the series of like photos and weird kind of things that you see as you're going into the show was actually
that intro that everybody knows.
Yeah, exactly. It was actually different for this episode. So it was weird. Like I didn't even realize that it was different until I went back and examined it and was like, oh yeah, it is actually different. So yeah, it was really cool. The first episode, I have the actual like what they said. So it says the opening narration was changed after the first episode from there's a sixth dimension. So in the first episode, the one we're talking about today, they said there's a sixth dimension. And a producer actually the producer's name was William Self, and he actually went to the people running the show, and they were like, hey, actually there's only 5 dimensions. There's like 4 dimensions. So the 5th one would be the one that we don't know about.
I think that just, it demonstrates a lack of imagination.
Yeah.
Maybe there is a 6th dimension. We just, that guy hasn't not experienced enough in the Jimi Hendrix sense. I don't know.
Yeah. I kind of want to think of everyone on the set of the Twilight Zone, this show that is literally about all these dimensions and stuff that we don't know about, just looking at this producer like, sorry, what? Like, excuse me. But yeah, it really is the one that it sold the series, basically. It first aired on October 2nd, 1959. So that's crazy. That's a long time ago. And this episode is still so, classic. It's still, a lot of people remember this episode.
Sure. And yeah, and there's, that's really saying something for a series that has so many episodes that people just can think of right off the top of their head.
Right.
I know there are so many times in the year where you just turn on any channel and you can see Twilight Zone Marathon, and you're going to see the one where the guy who wants to read books breaks his glasses. You're going to see the one where there's a guy who succeeds in politics because he's listening to the ghost of Adolf Hitler. You're going to see the one where it turns out they're all just like toys in a barrel. The one where the guy gets his consciousness transferred into a robot body, and then he switches back because his wife doesn't like it.
True.
There's so many that you can just think of. Mm-hmm. So it really says something that the very first episode of the entire series is one that ranks among the top memorable episodes of such a great show.
I also really found it interesting that this first episode dealt so much with isolation. I mean, this episode really hinges on, I mean, from the start to the finish, the whole point, the main thing that you're noticing through the whole thing is that nobody's around. He's isolated. He can't find another person. And I thought that was so interesting. And even at the end, when it's revealed, what's actually going on, and it's revealed that, he's actually in this, isolation chamber where he's being, tested to see how long he can be isolated in preparation for space travel. It just never, the poignancy of like the pointed nature of like being alone is so harmful to humans and to people. But also it tells it in kind of a goofy way throughout the story. They kind of start to do things in kind of a goofy way. Like the part in the show or in this episode where he sees a mannequin and he thinks it's an actual person, and he's kind of goofing around a little bit with that. The things that he says are kind of
right. Yeah. He stops and like talks to the mannequin after he realizes that it's a mannequin. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be fooled at first the way he was, but I could tell.
Yeah,
sitting in that truck from a distance.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could. Yeah, that's kind of why I found it so hilarious that he was like, and the way he talks is he's like, the whole time he's just like, I couldn't find another person. And like, he's kind of being very, anytime he feels like he's interacting with another person up until the very end, even when he's in the cafe in the beginning, and even when he realizes there's no one there, he's kind of just talking to the air. He's kind of just like, I have $2.85 and I'm hungry, and he's just, it's not until the very end when he kind of loses these niceties of like, okay, I'm freaked out. I'm not being polite anymore.
And so I guess it would be helpful to talk about the events in sequence. And you mentioned like the very beginning when he's walking down the road, he goes into that cafe and there's nobody there. But I mean, kudos to him because his hallucination involved, a pot of coffee, and there's like guys in the kitchen that are just ready to down, and then, but he doesn't, he ignores the pie, grabs up a cup of coffee, and then picks up a pickle. I've never had coffee and pickles, but it seems like a weird, but it is a hallucination. So who knows? Maybe it was a pie flavored pickle.
Yeah.
But it was weird that he knew exactly how much money he had. He said, $2.85, but he only pulled paper bills out of his pocket.
Huh. That is weird.
Where does the 85 cents come from? But then like, it's like in dreams, you just sort of know stuff.
Yep.
And it's not a dream hallucination, but it's the same kind of concept, right? It just, that number just came to him because his mind invented it.
Yeah. But also saying that he,
I guess maybe that's.
Oh, I'm so sorry. After he talks about the $2.85,
that's okay.
He's like, I have $2.85 American money, and then he's like, oh yeah, I'm an American, which also is kind of like a dream thing. Like I've definitely experienced that in dreams where you're like, oh yeah, I'm at the library or I'm wherever, because I often dream about being at the library. That's not weird.
Dream job.
Yeah.
That's all. Right. Okay, so yeah, he and then so he's in the cafe, he can't find anybody, but he has a cup of coffee and he speculates about the nature of what's happening to him. No, like the episode literally just began. He speculates that maybe he's asleep and then he's gonna wake up.
Yep.
As he's drinking the coffee. He thinks he's going to wake up, which is appropriate. But then he walks out after repeating himself several times that he wants ham and eggs over easy, and hash browns.
Yeah.
It's a very specific order. And he says it over and over again. And theme in this episode. But he walks outside and he walks into town. And I recognized this town right away.
Really?
Because it was filmed on a Universal backlot. I looked this up. It's the same backlot that they used for the town in Back to the Future. That's Valley.
Wow!
Square.
I had no idea.
The old clock tower. Yeah. Like you can see the clock isn't there because I think they added that for Back to the Future. But the courthouse there, that's the same building, the same little town setup.
That is so
Um,
cool.
yeah, so he walks into town and he sees a truck, right? After
Mhm.
looking around different places, he sees the truck and he thinks there's a person.
Right.
And like I said, I didn't know if I was really supposed to be fooled by that.
Right.
Um, because as original and iconic as the Twilight Zone is
Yeah.
at the time, how many times had a sophisticated television viewer been exposed to a situation where a character um, sees a person who isn't really a person? Now, somebody in the 21st century watching that episode, oh, well, maybe it's not really a person.
Right.
But at the time, would a person have been easily fooled by that gag? That's the weird thing about, going back and revisiting these, these iconic things that cliches came from. You don't know if it worked quite the same way at the time.
Yeah. Another thing that I noticed as we are moving along to him, seeing that person, and I think shortly after, he does that, he actually goes to a phone booth,
Mhm.
and is in the phone booth. And I noticed when he was in the phone booth, and one of the things that I jotted down was that he tries to contact the operator, which also goes into what you're saying.
Mhm.
Back then, he was looking for some kind of safe contact, and people back then, you could go to a phone and pick up the phone and contact the operator, which,
Right, and it was a given. You could count on that.
yeah, you could count on it. And so viewers back then in 1959 would have been like, oh my God, the operator's not there. That's unthinkable. You know what I
Right,
mean? So I thought that was really
and
interesting.
so it actually announced itself as a recording.
Yeah.
So this is really an operator. This is a recording. He knew it was a recording, and he continued to talk to the recording,
Yep.
which I can identify with because having been indoors and having had so little social interaction for so long. As an introvert, whenever Jennifer from the warranty department calls, I know she's not real to her anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. You will start to do that. I definitely have had some deep, deep, meaningful conversations with my cat, who's not recording but cannot speak back to me in a human way.
Sure, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe in dreams.
Right.
Yeah,
At the library. Yeah.
yeah, right. Talking cats at the library. It's perfect.
It's a great dream.
Um, so he actually shortly after that, the business with the telephone booth, and he gets trapped in there, like he can't get out.
Right.
I think that comes into play a little bit later. There's a repetition of that element a little bit later, but he has this moment where he actually vocalizes the feeling of being watched. He feels like he's being watched and listened to. So
Hmm.
he's experiencing paranoia,
Yep.
which just going through my Twitter feed, like I can see there are lots of people who are experiencing kind of a similar thing right now. There's paranoia. I think maybe like wait, the mosquitoes they're like mutated by 5G
Yeah.
that originated on windmill farms, and they're
Yeah.
spreading from China.
Right.
There's all kinds of like conspiracy theories and things people uh, are turning to
Mhm.
out of this paranoia, and maybe it's from the isolation. Who knows?
I think definitely, speaking towards people being paranoid in isolation more so, I can definitely relate to that as a person who, I'm so much a team-based person. Like I like to
Mm.
work with other people, especially when I'm working or when I'm coming up with ideas in general, whether it's work ideas or just ideas in my normal life. I really like to share those ideas with people and hear their feedback. And that really helps me form my ideas. I wouldn't say that I'm like totally and completely swayed by what they say, but I really like that communication in like how I feel about something. And so when you have nothing, when you have no one kind of to bounce ideas off of, it's really easy to start thinking like, oh my gosh, it's World War III, like everything's going crazy, and I could totally see how a person who's completely isolated would start to feel like really crazy things, like they're being watched and things like that.
Yeah, and your mind kind of becomes an echo chamber. Like things are just kind of bouncing back and forth, which I think maybe has something to do with maybe that's related to the theme of repetition.
Mm-hmm.
How he repeats himself so much that because that's not the only time he talks about feeling like he's being watched. Because later on, there's actually it's very explicit. There's like an eye on a window.
Yeah.
It's an optometrist. But he's, oh, I'm being watched, and this is the eye, and he repeats himself in the cafe, his order, like what he wants to eat. He says that over and over, and just about how he isn't really sure what's going on. He says the same thing so many times, sometimes in different ways, but he's just kind of repeating himself through the whole episode. I think that maybe has to do psychologically with the being alone and not having it becomes, it's like an echoes in a canyon, except it's your brain.
Yes, I think so too. That makes a lot of sense. That's interesting. Definitely.
Do you know, is there a term for the phenomenon when a character in a book or a TV episode or a movie actually says the title in dialogue?
I'm not 100% sure what.
There's probably some really long German word.
It definitely exists. I know that it does, but it's one of my favorite things. I am that kind of person. Like when I'm watching a movie and they say the name of the movie, I like look around and just see like who else noticed or who else cared. So yeah, I really love that is a part of this episode. I feel like
right. Yeah. Where is everybody?
Yeah, I feel like at that moment when he says that, I remember a few specific times where I think he only said, "Where is everybody?" Like that exact thing. I think he only said that once. Did he say it more than once? I feel like I remember him saying it once, definitely, because I remember being like amazed like a child.
I think he said it once, but in the broader context of all the repetition that happens during the episode and with the dialogue or monologue, I guess, because it's just him. But all the repetition, it makes it stand out more. And in a phrase, because it is the title of the episode, and because it does encapsulate the spirit of the episode, that he only says it once.
And it's what the viewer is thinking. It's what the viewer is thinking the whole time. What is going on?
Right. Yeah. And it's something that Rod Serling does really well, mixing elements of science fiction with other genres. And in this case, I guess it could be maybe mystery. Yeah, where the mystery of where is everybody? One thing that I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said in that, knowing he's really great, and I noticed this a lot just in the series as a whole, that he does a really good job of like anticipating what his audience is looking for. Like he knows what his audience is thinking, and that him having that character say that is literally the embodiment of what everyone's thinking. And I think that that's such a huge talent of his, is just like reading his viewers' minds as far as like what are we afraid of, what are we thinking, is so interesting.
So shortly after voicing his paranoia, I'm being watched, I'm being listened to, he goes into maybe it's like an old school pharmacy or like a soda fountain or something, and he like quotes Charles Dickens.
I love it.
Which is a Serling thing to have. There's like this there's this awareness of literature that maybe an enlisted man in the Air Force might not have realistically at the time anyway.
Right.
Not be able to quote Dickens, just like on the spot in the middle of hallucination. But
right. It's not even a small quote either. It's like a significant quote that he just puts out.
Right. Yeah. You would expect somebody who has like several English degrees to be able to quote Dickens at that length, not necessarily somebody who is concerned with other stuff. You've got to like dedicate close to your brain to literature to be able to quote like that, right?
Yeah.
But he, I think it's maybe from a Christmas Carol,
Mhm.
right? You're just he's saying, this is just hallucination brought on by something I ate or something. That's all this is.
I actually have it here. He says, I won't read it at length unless, but
Okay.
but he basically says that he's talking to just the wider world that he's living in, this crazy situation that he's in, and he says, you might just be an undigested bit of beef or a crumb of cheese or a blot of mustard, a fragment of an undone potato, which I was like, that's not something, exactly like you said, that's not something that he's just like, I remember vaguely that this quote came up in 8th grade. Like, he knows this. This is very,
Right.
this is important. Sterling really wanted this to be known by the viewer, because obviously, why else would he have this, like, several sentences, several statements of this quote? So it's obviously important, something that he wanted us to hear.
And then almost immediately there's another literary reference. And for a lot of this episode, I was thinking about Richard Matheson's book, I Am Legend, which has been turned into a movie several times, but at the time had not. It had just been published a few years before, because I had to stop and look that up. Like, wait a second, is this gonna turn out to be some kind of Last Man on Earth scenario,
right,
like from Richard Matheson's book or the Vincent Price movie, or Will Smith, I guess, or that guy who played Moses. But no, it turns out, I Am Legend was published in 1954, and this episode aired in 1959. It was probably, as somebody obviously who is thinking about science fiction a lot, Rod Serling had to have been familiar with Richard Matheson. And it's interesting to me that there's an entire rack of books called The Last Man on Earth. And that wasn't the title of Richard Matheson's book. It was I Am Legend, but the first movie that was adapted from that book was called The Last Man on Earth, and that was starring Vincent Price. I just found that kind of fascinating for a moment to ponder, and then press play again and moved on.
Right. That is a really interesting thing I often think about, especially with shows like this that seem to take so much imagination and so much creativity, and you wonder, like, where does this idea come from? And so, like, it's really cool to trace it and think, well, maybe that's where it came from, or that's where he maybe got that idea.
Sure. Yeah. Nothing happens in a vacuum.
Right. I think that's really interesting. So just some of my other favorite parts, I jotted down a few favorite, things about this episode. You just can't beat the camera angles and the lighting in the entire series. I mean, it's different than in anything that we have. In my opinion, it's different than anything we have now. And not to say that it's not every episode is better. Some of the episodes probably aren't shot great. You know what I mean? There's probably some episodes.
Well, they have like different directors and cinematographers, yeah.
Yeah, but I think just in general, it really captures, especially in this episode, there was an actual scene that was just dedicated to the traffic lights. As he's having his meltdown and is standing there pressing the button, there's a scene where it just goes to the traffic lights. And I just was like, what a weird thing that, a lot of directors and people nowadays would kind of gloss over. They wouldn't include that little clip, but it adds so much to kind of show the chaos going on in his brain. It just really added to that. And I thought, that's just something that doesn't happen always anymore, where they add those just extra little snippets that just add just the right amount of, like, knowledge, I guess, or just a little bit extra detail.
Sure. Yeah. It's real. It is attention. Yeah. To detail. And it's intentional. It wasn't just an accident. Somebody didn't say, like, oh, well, what if we just showed the traffic lights? And that's there for a reason. And maybe that's like a clue that he's hallucinating, because pushing the button actually has an effect on the traffic lights, which doesn't. It's like, yeah, you're just gonna have to wait.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
But yeah,
press this button if it makes you feel better.
Maybe that is. It's meant. maybe it is meant to be a mirror, the way that the lights are flashing back and forth. It's supposed to mirror the chaos that's happening just in his psyche right now, in that moment.
It kind of reminds me of in other like different horror movies and things like that. They'll have like a cuckoo clock or something that'll like go off in the background, and it's sort of like just that little extra to be like, it's about to get crazy, like things are about to be crazy, or they already are. And I don't know, I just like those little details. They make it better for me.
And that moment in particular, that's another moment with a lot of repetition. It's very heavy in repetition, saying, somebody help me, over and over. He's calling out as he's pushing this button and the lights are flashing.
Yeah.
It's really, really heavy in repetition. And that's also the moment where I think the rank is it's a colonel, an Air Force colonel, and some other folks who are kind of watching him. That's when we find out that it's just he's not really in this town. He's in a box with electrodes hooked up to his head, and people are watching him and monitoring him. I wonder why that's the moment that they decide to pull him out of this simulation.
I don't know. I'm curious.
What is it?
Yeah, I feel like I wonder why at some point they weren't like, okay, he's starting to like, they call it a hallucination. They call it like a sort of nightmare. And
Sure.
I wonder, why they wouldn't say, okay, he's obviously having a pretty serious hallucination. This cannot be good. But I guess that there wouldn't have been an episode if that had been the case. So.
I have thought of a way that maybe it makes sense.
Okay.
Toward the beginning of the episode, he accidentally knocks over a clock. And glass breaks, and I think the clock says like it's like 6:15 or 6:45 or something along those lines. It's a particular time on the clock, and then when it shows him inside the little chamber and he's like pounding on the wall in this, it's the button. He's like, he's like pounding on this wall and he's calling out for help. There is a clock in there and he's broken the glass with his fist. And the glass is, everywhere. And there's a guy that says, oh, don't, make sure he doesn't cut himself, as you're pulling him out. But it shows the clock and it shows the time, and it's the same time that was on the clock at the beginning of the episode. So maybe this is, it's dreams can seem like they last for hours, but in reality, they only last for, a handful of seconds. Maybe that's what's going on here. That all this takes place over the course of, 30 seconds in his brain.
Man, that would be so cool. That's crazy. That's a cool theory. I really like that theory because I feel like it really makes sense, and it ties into how they explain it. The doctor and the colonel explain it to him basically like they say it was a hallucination. The doctor says it was just, he asks him like, what's wrong with me? What happened to me, doc? Am I just off my rocker? And he says it was just a kind of nightmare. Right. That your mind made up. So that, totally ties into, and I love the connection with the clock too. I think that that's really significant. He doesn't do anything accidentally.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned earlier the element of, these very intentional details, and nobody in dialogue anyway, nobody points out what's going on with the clocks. The viewer has to put it together for themselves. But I think, to think about what the clocks mean and the implications that they have for the nature of the story kind of adds another layer to your enjoyment of the story, or at least your understanding of the story. But you can watch it and enjoy it without thinking about it on that level. So that's another way that Rod Serling was just a master storyteller. You can enjoy it on multiple levels.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Let me see here. So I really liked, now that we're close to the end of the episode, I have a couple of quotes from the colonel and stuff like that I really liked. The colonel, when he's addressing the other guys in the room, the other Air Force guys, I guess, that are in there. He says, but let me tell you something. If any one of you is confined to a box 5 feet square for 2.5 weeks, all by your lonesome without hearing a human voice other than your own, I'll give you especially good odds that your imagination would run away with you too, which really speaks to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about isolation and just making you, it so has the potential to make people kind of a little crazy, even in the isolation of your own home, I think could, start to kind of drive you crazy after a while. And he just kind of puts it into words that I thought was so interesting.
Right. And it's followed by, there's a guy who speaks up and he says, he's talking about all the things you can do with science. We can hook him up to feeding tubes. We can give him like mental stimulation in the form of, movies and different things for him to watch, but we can't simulate companionship.
Right.
It's one thing we can't do. We can't simulate what it's like to actually talk with another person, to have that connection, which really is the point of the whole episode, the necessity of society and connection with other humans.
Yeah.
A lot of people are hanging out right now, even the introverts. I know people are starting to go a little stir crazy, and that's not new. That started last week or the week before, but it's happening, and people are understanding, like, maybe I need to talk to people sometimes. I need to see other humans sometimes.
I have seen a lot of my friends that are, more introverted than I am necessarily. I find myself kind of in the middle a lot of the time, but a lot of my friends who are more introverted than I am are even saying, well, I liked going some places. Like, I liked seeing some people. Like, I don't want to just be alone all the time, and not to mention the amount of like pet adoption that has skyrocketed through this whole process. Cause,
right.
people don't realize how much they don't want to be alone until, you're kind of forced to. And I think that this episode in particular really speaks to, people's unexpected reaction to isolation. I think that, he didn't walk into that town in a complete panic. He walked into that town kind of joking almost. He has this funny conversation with the mannequin, and he goes into the cafe in the very beginning and has this coffee and is very kind of freaked out, but reasonably relaxed. But as time goes on, he just becomes more and more paranoid, more and more panicky. And I feel like that is exactly kind of what's happening as more and more of us are forced to be home. You kind of just start to be like, okay, I'm excited to get the mail, like I'm literally excited.
Right, yeah.
I'm like dressing up to go to my mailbox, and just, it speaks to the building of that kind of like stir craziness that you mentioned before.
Can you imagine having to undergo this experience without the internet?
I cannot. I really can't. My Wi-Fi, thank God, has held out because even that simulated, the Colonel did say, we can keep you entertained.
Right.
Which is, I gotta say, been very helpful. I've been pretty entertained through this, but I can't imagine if I wasn't, or if I, didn't have access to all of my friends via social media and my coworkers and stuff like that. It would be rough.
Yeah, there would be so much about the situation that would be different in terms of how we're handling it and what our personal and professional lives look like right now would be totally different without this ubiquitous, like always on method of communication it's deeper than the telephone, it's deeper than television, even because it allows for some measure of human connection.
Absolutely.
Which is, and even this, even though it's not the same as face-to-face in-person contact, it gives us some of that. So I think maybe it's helping us along a little bit further. And it occurs to me now, there's like a quarter of the state right now that doesn't have electricity. And so they're into quarantine. And now these storms from Sunday night, wipe out, all these power lines, and people are going to be without power for probably another week in some places. So now they're kind of experiencing what a quarantine would have been like at the time of this episode airing back in, 59? Maybe you still have telephone, but you really can't. I mean, well, maybe with your phone, your cell phone, you can
mobile device. But let's just say, apart from that, and eventually that's going to die. And our
Sure.
libraries are not open for charging stations and things like that right now, which is really unfortunate but necessary. But I think even I was thinking as you were speaking about social media and stuff, even indirect communication. If I share something and a friend of mine likes it or shares it or something, that's a form of indirect communication that we even if that was all there was, would be more than probably enough, hopefully, to kind of just be in some communication in some way. But yeah, and I think that the communication and the connection that we all have in this day and age also is huge for getting information. He was not in the episode, our main character was not given any information from the outside. He wasn't told anything to kind of let him know or ground him in his situation. So he, the worst case scenario, what if, I can only imagine what he was thinking, what if I'm the only person on earth? What if everyone's gone, not just in this town, but in everywhere?
And that makes me think, because there's someone who says next time you'll really be alone, meaning when he's in that little capsule, he's Major Tom flying around in space, he'll really be alone. He won't just be in a box with a bunch of people outside watching him. And he has this moment where he talks to the moon, so maybe he won't be so alone.
Right.
Will it make a difference psychologically when he is aware of what's going on? If he's there in that capsule and he's surrounded by the instrument panels, and there will be hours and hours at a time where he won't have direct communication with, I don't know, Houston or, whatever, air base they would be, communicating with on Earth. But would knowing his situation help at all? Maybe not, because I'm sure when he went into that box, he knew he was in a box and there were people just sitting outside watching. Maybe it doesn't make a difference, but
I think that for me, if I was in this position, if I was in this situation, which I hope I never am, but if I was, I think, knowledge of what I'm going into would help. But, we don't know if he knew, maybe even having the experience that he's had the next time when they mentioned, well, next time you really will be alone, maybe him having this experience will better prepare him possibly. I don't know. I like to think of things in my own interpretation if I was there. And I feel like having the instruments there, because when they opened the door, he didn't have any kind of instruments to interact with. So
he had the clock and the little panic button.
Yeah. So just being in a completely void space, that would definitely make it worse, I think. And I wonder why they didn't, if they're like, we can, feed you with this and we can give you, I think they talk about, we have it at the library. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like the film that you can look at and read stuff on.
Microfilm.
Yeah. So they're like, we can use microfilm to read and we can give you movies of a sort, he says. I was thinking, well, then why didn't you give it to him? I'd be like, I could have had all that.
Well, I guess maybe because it's an endurance test.
Yeah.
For if you have no interaction whatsoever, how long can you last? And it turns out maybe it's about 2.5 weeks. Right. But I don't know. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just thinking, I don't think we mentioned, but he was actually in the box for 448 hours, I think. Let's see. Yeah, he was in the box for 484 hours.
Right. About 2.5 weeks. Yeah.
484 hours and 36 minutes is what he was in there for. Just
So
I hadn't mentioned it.
So if he goes into the box and he knows, oh, I'm in a box, and there's people outside watching me, but the whole point is to see how far you can go with that.
Right.
You start your journey, tied to the top of a rocket, and eventually, like in 2.5 weeks, I'm going to get to go back down and I'm going to be on Earth again.
Right.
There's a light at the end. Maybe that would make it easier than I'm just going to be stuck in this box indefinitely.
And that really ties into what we're dealing with right now with this, the uncertainty of what's going on in the world right now. Nobody can tell you exactly, well, when am I going to be able to just go back to my normal life? When is this whole thing going to be over? And one of the most common things that you'll hear from everyone that I've come into contact with is, well, when all this is over,
right.
when all this stuff is done or whatever. So yeah, I think in my personal life with what's going on in the world right now, if someone said, okay, Katherine, in 2 months, your whole life is going to go back to normal. Everything's going to be fine. So you just need to survive for 2 months. It's not going to happen. But if it did, I would, that would make it a lot easier, I think, for me and for a lot of people. So I would have to venture and say yes, that him knowing, I just have to survive this for this long would be hugely helpful.
And we are coming up on, I think in 5 days, we will have reached the original end point that we were thinking of. We were going to reopen the libraries on the 20th of April.
Yep.
And that's just in 5 days. So I guess we'll just have to keep pushing it back until it's safe again. But even just having those incremental things to look forward to, like, oh, maybe it really will be May 11th. Maybe it really will be July 1st, whatever. How do you think this character will be different after this experience? And in a way, I'm really asking, like, how are we going to be different after this experience?
Yeah.
Like, so when he's carried out in that stretcher, and maybe he does do his moon journey or whatever, but surely that's going to stay with him, right?
I would assume it would stay with me for sure. I don't want to think that because of the correlation with what he went through and what we're going through, I don't want to think he was super traumatized and was never okay again, because I want to think that, if you relate that to what we're going through now, I think that the people, just all of us humans on Earth are going to benefit from this. And that's just me being a positive person. I really like to think that things, huge errors in the way that we handle situations and things that we weren't prepared for will be fixed as this continues. I know Cal's already has, developed so many policies that we didn't know we needed until this happened. So now we're so much better prepared. And so I just want to hope that the world does that as well. But as far as our character, like we've said, I hope that this better prepared him for whatever he had going on. If he was really going to make that moon journey, I hope that, this prepared him